Hello. Today's video is a response to a question that I received an embarrassingly long time ago that I just did not get around to answering in a timely fashion. For that I apologize, but I think it's going to be worth it. Today we're examining manual settings in your stabilization when you have in-body stabilization in your camera. That sounds like a whole lot of adjectives to describe something, so let's get into it. Today's question comes from a comment or a question to one of my previous videos asking specifically if the stabilization that I was getting off of a Sigma lens on my Sony camera could have been improved by manually telling the camera what focal length I was shooting in. With Sony cameras, you can go into your steady shot options and you can have it set to auto or manual, and that's specifically what we were talking about. When you go to manual, you can tell the camera manually what focal length to stabilize for. This was initially designed for using a completely non-electronic lens. So if I used an adapter and put some kind of a Canon FD lens on, or a lens with no electronics that's 20, 30, or 50 years old, I can still tell the in-body stabilization to work, but it might work better if I am using a camera that I've told what focal length to stabilize for. Now, the Sigma lenses are not truly native, as we've discussed before, but they do transmit information about what focal length they are shooting at to your cameras. Your camera knows what focal length it actually sees. I didn't expect a difference, and so I've never actually told my camera manually what focal length to stabilize before. But I didn't have a video actually examining it, and I'd never tested that theory. So what we're going to do now is take a look at the results. I shot a series of images with no stabilization, automatic stabilization, and where I told the camera manually what focal length to stabilize for. And to make sure that I was answering the question as it was asked, I did grab a Sigma E-mount lens. This is the 50mm art on a Sony a7R III. So without further ado, let's take a look at the results.
Before us, we have 3 tests for the stabilization system, all shot with the Sigma 50mm art on a Sony a7R III. And this first test here with the red icon, the red color tag, those were shot with no stabilization whatsoever. They started at, let me pull that back actually a little bit, at a 60th of a second and went to a 1/4. The second set was shot with stabilization turned on with all of its adjustments set to auto, and again started at a 60th of a second and went to a 1/4. This last test turned the stabilization controls to manual, and I manually plugged in that I was stabilizing a 50mm lens. In case this actually worked better, I went from a 60th of a second to a 1/2 of a second, though that ended up not being necessary. So first I wanted to show that the stabilization was doing something. So here's the 15th of a second shot with no stabilization, and here is the 15th of a second shot with. So I'm going to go in to these a little bit and show the same part of the image. And of course, we can immediately see that there was definitely a difference with stabilization. It was efficacious. It was adding to the shot. So if we get rid of the image that was done with no stabilization, because we don't need that anymore, and we pull up the image that was with the manual stabilization, it certainly is not better. It might even be a little bit worse. And that's an interesting result, and maybe that's just a different amount of hand-holding. I'm not really sure. So let's take the images here. These are the 1/8 of a second. And again, we're seeing that there is certainly no benefit that I'm seeing from manually typing in the focal length. And we're starting to get motion blur in both of them, which I kind of expect shooting an 1/8 of a second with a 50mm lens. And they do just get blurrier from there. So not a ton of point in continuing to analyze this. And certainly if we just look at the difference between here at a 1/4 of a second and a 1/2 of a second, it's not giving me greater length or time that I can shoot with a little bit of motion blur. So what do I make out of this? I'm probably going to say that if we have a lens with no electronics in it and the camera has no ability to know its stabilization, then manually telling it the focal length that we're stabilizing for would be useful. But with a lens like the Sigma, it certainly is not adding any sort of a benefit.
My takeaway, as you've already seen, is that for Sigma lenses, and in all likelihood when I'm using a modern day Loxia lens, which of course is a manual aperture, it still transmits electronic information about focal length, and I don't think that there's going to be a benefit for me with those types of lenses in manually telling the camera what focal length to stabilize for. But if I use a really old lens with no electronics in it, I will come back and tell it. And I think this is a really interesting feature. We're going to see it spread to, I think, every mirrorless system that has in-body stabilization. So keep a lookout for this in your Panasonics and your Olympus and your Fuji cameras, as in-body stabilization becomes the norm in our mirrorless cameras. Thank you so much for the question. I'm sorry that it took so long to answer it. If there's something in camera features or in shooting that you'd like for me to examine, get in the comments. I'd love to tackle it. Of course, I'm going to ask you to like and subscribe. I appreciate it. It means a lot to me, and it's free. You knew that. And until next time, have a wonderful day. Bye.